Among Sega fans, the Streets of Rage series demands a certain level of respect that few games can equal. The original debuted in 1991 on the Sega Genesis and became an instant classic. The music, the gameplay, and its gritty world really scratched that beat-em-up itch that fans had been craving. The following year, Streets of Rage 2 appeared on the Genesis with some major improvements to the graphics, another kick-ass soundtrack, and even better gameplay. It's often considered one of the platform's best games and is spoken of highly by even Nintendo fans. This of course meant that the expectations for a Part 3 were sky high. The first two had been reasons to brag for Sega fans, so anything less than stellar was simply unimaginable. Something was clearly wrong, however. The first two Streets of Rage games had been released in North America nearly at the same time as their Japanese counterparts, where the series was named Bare Knuckle. But Part 3 hit Japan first in March of 1994, with gaming magazines covering it in their import sections. The Western version wouldn't show up until months later in the summer, a side effect of the numerous changes that Sega of America would make to the product. In this episode, we will be taking a look at Streets of Rage 3, the controversy of its English localization, and talk a bit about its quality. I hope you guys enjoy my review of Streets of Rage 3 for the Sega Genesis. If you've played Streets of Rage 2, Part 3 feels very similar in the gameplay department, but adjusts and adds a few things to really improve the overall experience. First is the addition of the duck and roll. Using this, you can quickly move to the front or rear of the play area to avoid attacks or to get a better position to confront enemies. It's accomplished by pressing up or down twice quickly for the direction you want to go. You also now have a dash to quickly get across the screen. Pressing twice left or right quickly allows you to run, a big upgrade that really speeds up the gameplay. There are also some new attacks based on running. There is also a new gauge that governs your power and special attacks. In the previous game, using your special attacks drained a bit of life every time, but here you get to use them without penalty if you wait for the strength gauge to rebuild. It makes for a better balancing gameplay and allows you more freedom with your moveset. Be wary, however. While you hit harder and do more damage when the gauge is high, you are also weaker and take more damage while it's low. Finally, your blitz attacks have a star system in place that give them more power. As your score goes up, you gain up to 3 stars that make your blitz moves more effective. These stars stay with you until you take a death, which will downgrade you by 1 each time. Outside of these additions and changes, the gameplay is largely similar overall. Blitz attacks are still performed the same, attacking enemies behind you is the same, and the grapple system is largely untouched. There is a noticeable speed increase here, but it isn't jarring or unwelcome. Axel, Blaze, and Skate make a return, and there is a newcomer called Dr. Zan who's part cyborg. There's even a few hidden characters now. 2-player co-op multiplayer of course is in there, as is the battle mode that allows you to fight a friend. And rounding out all these additions are the multiple endings you can get that really add to the replay value. Streets of Rage 2 had been an impressive upgrade visually over the first, and Part 3 doesn't mess with a good thing. We get a very similar looking experience here with large sprites, detailed environments, and a performance that rarely sees any slowdown or flicker. There are some enhancements to the animation thanks to the new moves you can do, and there are some new enemies in there as well. Perhaps the greatest visual asset, however, is the stage variety. Now coming in at 24 megabits, each and every stage is radically different from one another, and you rarely see assets reused. From oceanside battles to running from a bulldozer, there's always something new to see and do. While I appreciate this variety, it seems to come at the cost of special effects like parallax scrolling and similar graphical features. Luckily, other areas help shoulder the load. The color is excellent, the enemies detailed, and your fighter looks incredible. It isn't the leap Part 2 was over Part 1, but still quite the solid looking beat 'em up. The one area that the first two Streets of Rage games really nailed was the music. These are two of my favorite soundtracks of the entire 16-bit generation. They were absolutely perfect, and set the entire tone and feel of those games. Part 3 here doesn't quite live up to those two games, however. It feels like music producer Yuzo Koshiro really let his experimental flag fly, and the results were interesting to say the least. While I did enjoy some of the selections, most of it simply didn't live up to the stuff we had before. It felt more random and had a much harder edge. I'd even go so far as to say there are sounds here that are genuinely off-putting. Here are a few examples for you to see for yourselves. You can't talk about Streets of Rage 3 without bringing up the regional changes that exist between the Japanese and English versions. These changes range from little things like colors and names used for the main cast of characters and enemies, to major changes such as censorship and difficulty. First and foremost, the English versions are noticeably more difficult. Enemies do more damage to you, and you take longer to kill them. In Streets of Rage 3, the game cannot be finished on easy, and instead ends at stage 5 with a bad ending that basically says you suck. Female enemies have also been covered up in the Western versions, and the homosexual boss Ash has been removed entirely. Axel, Blaze, and Skate have different colored outfits, and most of the enemies, weapons, and bosses have been renamed. The story to the two versions are also radically different. In Japan, Bare Knuckle 3 has a story about an experimental weapon that is capable of massive damage. It's used in the city, killing thousands of civilians. You are sent in to uncover the people behind it all and stop the war they are trying to start. In the English versions, you get a lame-ass plot about Mr. X replacing people with robots. There are other smaller differences in color and set pieces here and there as well. Of all these changes, the difficulty is the biggest. No joke, playing these games back to back, it's clear the Japanese version is considerably easier. While that will matter to some more than others, it made a huge difference during co-op gameplay. While just about anyone could play the first two Streets of Rage games on normal, Part 3 will massacre lesser players, making a playthrough with family and friends a somewhat taxing experience. Gimping the easy mode in the English release also exacerbates the issue because you can't finish the game. Sega was unwisely concerned about making games harder because they were hyper-focused on game rentals at the time. This came to the detriment of some of their titles, this one included. I want to be real clear here. I think the improvements to Streets of Rage 3's gameplay are very nice. It's faster, there are more moves, and it makes for a better playing and feeling experience. Pound for pound, it's the best playing of the original 16-bit trilogy by a mile. The addition of multiple endings is cool as well. These endings aren't just based on some simple text choice either. They depend on your difficulty setting and how well you perform during certain situations. There are some things about Streets of Rage 3 that really hurt it for me, however. While the story changes and censorship bothered some people, I didn't really care much about any of that. Bare Knuckle 3 was in Japanese and I didn't understand the story anyway, and I really didn't care about the costume changes either. What I did care about is what made the first two games such an incredible experience: the music. I can't really sugarcoat my feelings here. Even stating that the music in Streets of Rage 3 is an acquired taste would be dishonest. Much of what is here is point-blank painful to the ears, and it's the kind of painful that gets worse and more irritating the longer you listen to it. Whereas the stuff in the first two games set a tone and ambiance that enhanced the setting and gameplay, there's stuff in Part 3 that feels like someone put a bunch of monkeys in a room to bang on pots and pans for an hour. The sad thing is that some of the entries are actually really good, but the gulf between the good and the bad is absolutely massive. You'll go from something that isn't bad at all to wanting to mute the television a few minutes later. I can deal with all the minor changes. I can deal with the game being harder. What I can't deal with is an eccentric soundtrack that ranges in quality so hard that it took one of the finest elements of the series and threw it straight out the window. I'd also like to mention that while Streets of Rage 3 is still a good looking game, its surprising lack of parallax and line scrolling effects do impact its appeal. Here you get more stages with backgrounds that are flat and lacking depth, something that should have been ramped up heavily. There's even a few visual assets recycled from the second game. My final complaint will fall on deaf ears for some of you, but why the hell is Adam not playable, or at least a hit and unlockable? I mean, the dude was in the main cast of the first one, then reduced to a simple plot point in the second, and again here in the third, he's back to a cameo style appearance just to say he's there. This is bullshit. I know there are fans of Skate and Zan out there, so I won't belittle their contribution, but to omit Adam again is straight up annoying. I mean, they made a freaking kangaroo playable over him. Streets of Rage 2 had been such a hit that the sequel had a hell of a task in front of it to equal. I think Sega did an excellent job expanding the gameplay to meet that challenge. It really does play better, it's faster, there are more moves, more variety, and it just feels like a true upgrade. But there are things here that will affect how many of you feel about it. The changes in the English versions are head-scratching to say the least. The story has been simplified to the point where it makes you think Sega felt its Western fans were morons, and that difficulty spike was simply unnecessary. If Sega wanted to make the game harder, they should have just set the default difficulty to hard, and given us incentives to play it like additional unlockables that you could only get by playing it. Luckily, there is an English translation of the Japanese version these days to offset most of the changes Sega of America made. But as I said, the music selections here are the biggest hurdle to overcome. For those of you that enjoyed the previous entries and expect more of the same, well, you had your work cut out for you. The entire feel of this soundtrack is different, and it likely will be the biggest influencer on your opinion of the rest of the game. For me, Streets of Rage 3 was an excellent playing, good-looking beat-em-up with a soundtrack that I sometimes liked and I sometimes couldn't stand. This stood in direct contrast to the earlier games, which were all excellent all the way around. This leaves Part 2 here in a weird place of being both better and worse at the same time. It makes for a hell of a conversation piece with a wide swath of opinions. If you haven't played it but enjoy beat-em-ups, I do recommend you try it out. After all, a Streets of Rage with issues is still one hell of a great experience. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.